Case 1. The Murder of Yara Gambirasio. Italy, 2010. In the heart of northern Italy, a teenage girl left the gym one late November afternoon and simply vanished. What began as a routine errand turned into one of the country's most haunting mysteries. The story would soon captivate a nation, unraveling like a detective thriller no screenwriter could have crafted. Yara Gambara was born on May 21, 1997, in Brembate di Sopra, a small, serene town nestled just outside Milan. Known for its medieval charm and quiet streets, this sleepy community of around 7,000 souls was the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened, or so it seemed. Yara came from a close-knit family rooted in the town for generations. With an older sister and 2 younger brothers, she was the kind of girl everyone knew. Friendly, grounded, and passionate about gymnastics. Her second home was the local sports center just a few hundred yards away, where she trained regularly. On the evening of November 26, 2010, 13-year-old Yara told her parents she was heading to the gym, not for a workout, but just to drop off a stereo for her coach. It was around 5:15 p.m. when she stepped out the door, promising to be back in about an hour. No one thought twice. After all, it was a quick walk, and Brembate di Sopra was considered safe. But as the clock ticked past 7 p.m., a quiet worry crept into the house. Yara was never this late. Her mother called her cell phone at 7:11 p.m. It went straight to voicemail. That was the moment everything changed. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. The case quickly escalated beyond the limits of the small town. Just 7 miles away, in a larger neighboring city, the file landed on the desk of seasoned detective Letizia Ruggeri. Known for her sharp instincts and calm under pressure, Ruggeri wasted no time. She dispatched officers to Brembate di Sopra to initiate a ground search and called in the military police for reinforcement. The first step was to reconstruct Yara's final known movements. After interviewing her parents, investigators went straight to the gym. There, her coach confirmed that Yara had shown up around 5:30 p.m., just as she'd told her family. Friends remembered seeing her too, smiling, chatting, stretching, and doing a few light exercises before heading out. Everything about the visit had seemed routine. Then came a vital detail. At 6:44 p.m., Yara had sent a text message to a friend. That was the last anyone heard from her. Based on that timestamp, investigators narrowed the window of her disappearance to the short walk between the sports center and her home. Somewhere in that narrow stretch, Yara vanished. Police units fanned out across the town. One group swept the streets, others knocked on doors, canvassed witnesses, and reviewed whatever CCTV footage they could find. Some witnesses near the gym reported seeing a girl matching Yara's description, speaking with 2 men near a red car. But nothing definitive came from those leads. No proof it was her. They turned the sports complex upside down. Nothing. Not a single trace. Meanwhile, local officers, military police, and firefighters pushed deeper, into fields, along footpaths, even combing the riverbank that sliced through the town. Volunteers poured in. Still, Yara was nowhere to be found. Detective Ruggeri brought in the canine units next. The dogs took the scent from Yara's belongings and began tracking. But instead of moving toward her home, they led searchers in the opposite direction, toward the neighboring town of Mapello. That set off alarm bells. Ruggeri ordered a trace on Yara's cell phone. The data confirmed it. At 6:49 p.m., just 5 minutes after her last text, her phone pinged a tower in Mapello. That made one thing chillingly clear. Yara didn't go there on foot. Someone had taken her. The trail stopped cold there. With no further signs and no body, the investigation now pivoted to two possibilities. Either Yara had been abducted, or less likely, she had run away. But that theory fell apart quickly. She'd made plans to meet a friend the next day. That last text didn't read like the words of a girl planning to disappear. Still, every stone had to be turned. Detectives spoke to everyone close to Yara. Family, friends, neighbors. No red flags. Nothing suggested she was unhappy or in trouble. As a precaution, Ruggieri ordered wiretaps on the phones of family members and dozens of people in their circle. She then took an extraordinary step. She requested the location data of every phone that had been in Mapello on the night Yara disappeared. It was a long shot, but if the kidnapper had a phone on them, it would have pinged the same tower. The scope of that search was massive. Over 15,000 phones had connected to towers in the area that evening. Investigators began the painstaking work of sifting through each one. A dedicated team was formed to monitor thousands of numbers that raised any suspicion. While the search continued on the ground, day after day passed without answers. No new clues, no sightings, no breakthroughs. As weeks dragged into months, Ruggieri's confidence in the physical search began to wane. Her hopes rested on the mountain of cell phone data and the belief that somewhere in that list was the key to unlocking what happened to Yara. The wiretaps produced little at first, just hours upon hours of ordinary conversations, irrelevant chatter, and dead ends. But then, weeks into the operation, something unexpected surfaced. In one recorded call, a man's voice broke through the noise. "Forgive me, Lord. I didn't kill her." The phrase sent a jolt through the investigation team. The man was quickly identified as Mohammed Fikri, a Moroccan construction worker who lived in Mapello, the same town where Yara's phone had last pinged. It was a direct link to the only tangible clue they had. But the officers monitoring the calls had been working with a significant delay. There were simply too many recordings to process in real time. Fikri's call was from 3 days earlier, and by the time they flagged it, he was already gone. He was on a ship bound for Morocco. To the investigators, the timing and context were too suspicious to ignore. Acting quickly, Italian authorities coordinated to intercept the vessel. Fikri was detained on board and brought back to Italy under suspicion of involvement in Yara's disappearance. As this was unfolding, police made another discovery. Fikri's car had a blood-stained mattress in the trunk. It was seized and rushed to the lab, where forensic experts conducted urgent tests. But the result threw another wrench into the case. It wasn't Yara's blood. In fact, it wasn't even human. Then came the crushing blow. A more accurate analysis of Fikri's phone call, translated properly from his native language, revealed a devastating mistake. The chilling phrase that had alarmed investigators was a mistranslation. With further checks confirming his alibi, it became clear. Fikri had nothing to do with the crime. The police had no choice but to release him. By now, the case had gripped the nation. Yara's face was on every television screen, every newspaper front page. Italy watched the investigation unfold in real time. Hearts pinned on hope. When Fikri was arrested, many believed justice was finally near. So when he was cleared, the public felt the same gut punch as the investigators. And just like that, they were back at square one. The phone monitoring continued. So did the searches. But every new lead ended the same way, in silence. Then, exactly 3 months after Yara vanished, on February 26, 2011, the case took a haunting turn. A man from Cignolo d'Isola, a town just 6 miles from Brembate di Sopra, was out flying his remote-controlled plane in the countryside. When the aircraft malfunctioned, he was forced to land it in an overgrown field thick with tall grass. As he walked through the brush to retrieve it, something caught his eye, a bundle of what looked like discarded rags. But as he got closer, he noticed something else. Boots sticking out from beneath the pile. A call to police followed moments later. When officers arrived, they found a human body, badly decomposed, partially concealed beneath the rags. It was nearly unrecognizable. Yet when Detective Letizia Ruggeri arrived on scene, she didn't need confirmation. The clothing was unmistakable. It was what Yara had been wearing the day she disappeared. Nearby, scattered in the grass, were her iPod, house keys, SIM card, and the phone's removable battery. But the phone itself was gone. To lead the forensic investigation, authorities called in Italy's most respected pathologist. Her analysis confirmed what many feared. Yara had been killed by multiple stab wounds. There were no signs of sexual assault, but some of her clothes had been removed, leading investigators to suspect a possible sexual motive. And there was more. Forensic experts discovered a key clue on Yara's clothing: microscopic fibers commonly found in a specific type of industrial fabric, materials typically used in specialized manufacturing. This pointed to a new theory. Yara's killer might work in a textile-related facility in the area. It wasn't the breakthrough they had hoped for, but it was something. And now, after 3 agonizing months, the real hunt for Yara's killer had finally begun. There was a glimmer of hope when forensic investigators discovered 2 foreign DNA samples, one on Yara's gloves, the other on the battery from her missing phone. But that hope faded quickly. The samples were too small, the genetic material too limited. Worse yet, no matches surfaced in any national or international databases. Just like that, the trail went cold again. Then, 2 months later, a breakthrough. Detective Letizia Ruggeri received a call that would change everything. During a meticulous re-examination of Yara's belongings, forensic specialists had uncovered biological material on her underwear. This time, they struck gold. A full male DNA profile, an unknown man, a likely killer. With a genetic fingerprint finally in hand, Letizia swung into action. She divided her team into specialized units. One group began collecting DNA samples from everyone in Yara's orbit. Relatives, neighbors, friends, coaches, even casual acquaintances at the gym. Another was tasked with sifting through the massive trove of cell phone data, focusing on numbers that traveled from Brembate di Sopra to Mapello on the night Yara vanished. Each of those individuals would also be asked to submit DNA, but the scale was enormous. The process was slow. Even with 3 labs across Italy working full-time, it could take years to test thousands of samples. And so the waiting began. Over the following months, the DNA samples piled up, but not one of them matched the killer's profile. Letizia knew they needed a fresh angle, something bold. Then she remembered something. Not far from where Yara's body had been discovered was a nightclub, one with a murky reputation, known for attracting rough crowds and people with criminal records. Letizia decided to test a theory. Killers often dispose of their victims in familiar places. What if the murderer had frequented that nightclub? She dispatched officers to stake out the club on Friday and Saturday nights. Each visitor was approached and asked for a DNA sample. Because the club required membership cards, The team also gained access to the database of past visitors, allowing them to track down and test individuals who'd walked through those doors months, or even years, before. The odds weren't promising, but Letizia had nothing else. Then, against all expectation, the lab called. They had a match, or almost. The DNA belonged to a man named Damiano. It matched the killer's profile, but only partially. That meant he wasn't the perpetrator himself, but he was almost certainly related. Investigators quickly ruled Damiano out. He had been abroad at the time of Yara's disappearance. But this partial match was a critical clue. The DNA on Yara's body almost certainly belonged to someone in Damiano's bloodline. The hunt now shifted focus from the suspect himself to his family tree. The idea of tracking a killer through a relative's DNA was almost unheard of in Italy at the time. Genetic genealogy was still in its infancy. Letizia and her team were navigating uncharted territory. They began painstakingly tracing Damiano's lineage, trying to identify every male relative who could potentially be the killer. That's when another twist surfaced. Damiano's mother had once worked as a housekeeper for none other than Yara's family. For 10 years, she had been inside their home, cleaning their rooms, folding their clothes. She had left the job just a few years before Yara went missing. When investigators informed her that someone from her own family might be connected to the murder, she was horrified. But even with that chilling revelation, the case dragged on. Months passed. Investigators ruled out Damiano's immediate family. That left the daunting task of expanding the search across hundreds, maybe thousands, of distant relatives, many of whom were scattered across Italy and beyond. Public opinion began to sour. As time wore on with no arrest, media outlets criticized the investigation. Talk shows speculated. Headlines questioned the competence of the police. Soon, politicians began to weigh in, calling for Letizia's removal from the case. But despite the growing pressure, she remained, undaunted and more determined than ever. Despite the mounting pressure from the public and the media, Detective Letizia Ruggeri pressed on, relentless in her pursuit of Yara's killer. While critics questioned her methods, she and her team were quietly digging into the past, centuries into the past. They began tracing genealogical records dating as far back as 1716, meticulously building family trees from archived documents. It was an exhausting and often frustrating process, with thousands of names examined and countless dead ends. Then, in September 2011, a fragile thread of hope emerged. One of the family trees pointed to a man named Giuseppe, long deceased. It seemed like just another name among thousands, until they discovered that Giuseppe's widow had kept envelopes he had sealed with his saliva. Forensic analysts retrieved the DNA. The results were electrifying. Giuseppe was almost certainly the father or grandfather of the man whose DNA had been found on Yara's underwear. It was the most promising lead yet. Giuseppe had 2 sons, and both agreed to provide DNA samples. Letizia braced for the results, but the tests revealed yet another crushing disappointment. Although both men were closely related to the suspect, neither was the killer. Letizia was stunned. If Giuseppe's sons weren't a match, there was only one plausible explanation left. Giuseppe had fathered a child outside of his marriage, a child no one in the family knew about. That revelation took the investigation in a far more delicate and difficult direction. Detectives began quietly interviewing people who had known Giuseppe during his lifetime, asking if he might have had a secret relationship. It was a long shot, but nearly a year later, they caught a curious lead. Apparently, Giuseppe had spent 2 weeks every May starting in the 1960s, at a spa in a small town near Milan. He always went alone. Never once did he bring his wife. Letizia immediately requested access to the spa's historical guest records. Incredibly, they still existed. Investigators pored over them, cross-referencing names of women who had stayed at the spa during the same periods as Giuseppe. It was a painstaking task that dragged on for over a year, but Letizia refused to give up. Still, no clear link emerged, and as word of the investigation spread, the public grew increasingly fascinated with the idea of Giuseppe's possible secret child. Italian journalists jumped into the hunt, chasing down stories of illegitimate children from small towns and decades-old affairs. In one tiny village alone, 5 such cases were uncovered. Despite all this noise, the real breakthrough didn't come until the summer of 2014. Among the flurry of tips and speculation, one name surfaced: Esther Arzuffi. Someone suggested she may have had an affair with Giuseppe. Letizia's team dug into their own records and made a surprising discovery. They had already collected a DNA sample from Esther 2 years earlier. At the time, the analysis had shown no connection between Esther and the unknown killer, but Letizia wasn't convinced. She ordered the sample reanalyzed. That decision changed everything. It turned out that a catastrophic error had been made. The original expert had mistakenly compared the killer's DNA to Yara's, not to Esther's. A second analysis, correctly done, confirmed the truth. Esther Arzuffi was the killer's mother. After nearly 4 years, Letizia finally had a name and a family. Esther had 3 children, including twins, a boy and a girl. On paper, they were the children of Esther's legal husband, but based on the DNA, it now appeared Giuseppe had fathered them in secret. And since the killer was male, investigators zeroed in on Esther's son. He was 42 years old at the time, a construction worker, married with children, living in none other than Mapello, the very town where Yara's cell phone had last signaled before going dark. The net was finally closing in. Detective Letizia Ruggeri knew the importance of discretion. If this man was indeed the killer, the last thing she could afford was to spook him. So she devised a clever plan to collect his DNA without raising suspicion. She discovered that he traveled the same road every day. With quiet precision, she arranged a routine sobriety checkpoint along his route. When the man was pulled over, he had no reason to be alarmed. He blew into the breathalyzer, unaware that the saliva left on the device would be rushed straight to the lab for DNA testing. After nearly 4 years of painstaking investigation, the result came back: a full match. The DNA found on Yara's underwear belonged to Massimo Giuseppe Bossetti. On June 16th, police made the arrest. Bossetti, a married father of 3 and a construction worker living in Mapello, the very town where Yara's phone last signaled, denied everything. He claimed total innocence. And so the case headed to trial. As prosecutors prepared, investigators unearthed disturbing evidence that painted a dark picture of Bossetti. His internet search history revealed troubling patterns, including material related to minors. Worse still, cell tower data placed his phone in Yara's hometown the evening she disappeared. But at 5:45 p.m., just before she was last seen, his phone was switched off. It wasn't turned back on until the following morning. Then came a critical piece of visual evidence. Surveillance footage from that same evening showed a car, without license plates, circling near the sports center where Yara was last seen. At the time, police couldn't identify it. Now they could. It was Bossetti's vehicle. And forensic tests revealed that fibers from the seats in his van matched fibers found on Yara's clothing. A witness from Yara's town also stepped forward. She told police that on the night of the disappearance, she had gone outside to take out the trash when she saw a car speeding past her house. It resembled Bossetti's vehicle. Inside, she said, was a child, and she heard screaming. Investigators also learned that Bossetti regularly stopped at a pizza restaurant on the same street where Yara lived. This suggested he may have been watching her for some time, possibly planning the abduction well in advance. Bossetti tried to explain the surveillance footage by saying he had simply been driving home from work, but his co-workers, phone records, and security cameras told a different story. He hadn't worked that day at all. The trial began in summer 2015, 1 year after his arrest. It instantly became a media sensation across Italy. Most of the public believed Bossetti was guilty, but what no one expected was the twist that the defense would deliver. The prosecution presented a clear theory. Bossetti had been stalking Yara, perhaps for weeks. On the evening she left the gym, he intercepted her, took her to the remote field where her body was eventually found, and murdered her. Their belief was that he may have intended to assault her, but something, fear, hesitation, or interruption, stopped him. Bossetti's wife testified that he was home with her and the children, eating dinner at the time of Yara's disappearance. But her account was contradicted by footage near the gym and by 3 independent witnesses who placed Bossetti's car in the area that evening. The defense maintained Bossetti's innocence. He insisted he had nothing to do with Yara's death. His lawyers claimed that he suffered frequent nosebleeds and proposed a far-fetched possibility: that someone else had come into contact with his blood and somehow transferred it to Yara's underwear. They also challenged the integrity of the DNA evidence itself. According to the defense, the sample found on Yara came from a type of DNA that mutates very slowly over generations, meaning it could theoretically belong to any distant relative of Bossetti's, not necessarily him. But forensic experts for the prosecution firmly rejected that argument. They testified that the DNA was a definitive match, not partial, not distant, but exact. The evidence, they said, left no room for doubt. But the defense had one final move, and it stunned the courtroom. Midway through the trial, Bossetti's lawyers shifted the spotlight onto a new figure. They named a surprising alternate suspect, a young gym instructor named Silvia. It was a bold accusation. After Yara's body had been recovered, forensic experts had reportedly found traces of Silvia's blood on the sleeve of Yara's jacket. That alone raised serious questions. Then came a curious admission from Silvia's father. He told investigators that the night Yara disappeared, Silvia had come home in tears and cried through the night. Investigators also discovered that Silvia had exchanged several messages with her brother that evening, but those texts were deleted shortly afterward. No record of their content remained. When questioned, Silvia claimed she couldn't explain her behavior that night. She said she had no memory of why she was crying, what she wrote to her brother, or how her blood ended up on Yara's clothing. In court, her answers were vague at best. Faced with direct questions, she simply replied, "I don't know." It was a strange, unsettling turn. Yet despite the mystery surrounding Silvia's involvement, her silence and the unclear circumstances were not enough to undermine the case against Bossetti. The DNA evidence remained the cornerstone of the prosecution's argument, and it was rock solid. In the summer of 2016, after years of investigation, speculation, and a trial followed by millions, Massimo Bossetti was found guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. His legal team attempted appeals, but every effort to overturn the verdict failed. Then, another twist, this time personal. The The very next day after the conviction, Bossetti's wife visited him in prison. There, in a devastating confession, she told him that none of their 3 children were biologically his. She admitted to having had affairs with multiple men over the years. The betrayal added yet another layer of tragedy to a case already mired in darkness. Even the family at the center of the investigation harbored secrets. DNA tests eventually confirmed that Esther's 3rd child, the one not involved in the crime, was not fathered by her legal husband, nor by Giuseppe, the man believed to be Bossetti's biological father. The truth, it seemed, was messier than anyone could have imagined. Massimo Bossetti remains behind bars to this day, but questions still linger. The unresolved mystery of Silvia, her blood, her deleted messages, her emotional collapse, continues to haunt those who followed the case closely. For some, the anomalies surrounding her involvement are too unsettling to ignore. They argue that Bossetti may have been wrongly convicted, that perhaps the DNA evidence was mishandled or manipulated. Yet the overwhelming consensus remains. Every piece of evidence, collected, tested, and retested by some of Italy's most respected forensic experts, pointed to Bossetti. The investigation, though imperfect and clouded by twists, was thorough. The odds of a wrongful conviction, experts insist, are slim. Still, the Yara Gambirasio case stands as one of the most disturbing and high-profile criminal investigations in Italy's modern history. A haunting reminder of how evil can lurk in the most ordinary places, and how justice, no matter how delayed or contested, can eventually catch up. Share your thoughts on this story in the comment section. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Case 2. The Murder of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story. Robin Cornell was born on November 30th, 1978, in sunny Florida. She was the younger of 2 sisters and was raised by her devoted mother, Jan, who had taken on the role of both parents after their father stepped out of their lives. Jan poured everything she had into her daughters, determined to give them a safe and loving home. When Robin was 10 years old, the 2 of them moved to Cape Coral, a quiet coastal town where Jan had landed a job at the local hospital. She found a cozy townhouse just minutes from work. With her older daughter already off at college, it was now just Jan and Robin, mother and daughter, side by side. Robin quickly embraced her new surroundings. She made friends at school with ease, joined sports teams, and became known for her kindness and love of animals. She once found an injured bird, brought it home, and cared for it until it could fly again. That was Robin, compassionate, full of life, and curious about the world. Jan, too, found happiness. She settled into her new job and began dating a man named Donald, her first serious relationship in years. After so long spent putting her children first, Jan was finally carving out space for herself. At work, she also met Lisa, a friendly woman who would become her closest friend. In early May 1990, knowing Lisa was struggling financially, Jan invited her to move into their townhouse. With a spare room upstairs and the added benefit of splitting rent, it seemed like a perfect arrangement. Lisa and 11-year-old Robin hit it off immediately. Lisa even offered to help with babysitting while Jan worked night shifts at the hospital. Then came the night that would change everything. On May 9th, just a week after Lisa moved in, Jan planned to spend the evening at Donald's house watching a game. She hesitated at first. She didn't want to leave Lisa alone with Robin for too long. But Lisa assured her it was no problem. Comforted by the offer, Jan left for Donald's, planning to return before dawn for her early shift at the hospital. But she fell asleep on the couch. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. When Jan woke around 3 a.m., she quickly gathered her things and drove home. As she reached the front door, something felt off. The door was locked, both locks, but Lisa only had a key to the top lock. That wasn't all. As Jan fumbled with her keys, she heard footsteps inside, just for a moment, then silence. She knocked. No answer. Now seriously alarmed, Jan walked around to the back of the house. There, she found the sliding door slightly ajar, something she never allowed. Still hoping for an innocent explanation, she told herself Lisa might have let the cats out and forgotten to close it. She stepped inside. The house was dark. The silence was heavy. As she walked into the kitchen, her stomach dropped. Family photos, normally hanging on the living room wall, were now neatly arranged on an ironing board. Photos of Robin and her older sister placed side by side, as if on display. There was no reason for them to be there. The home was in disarray. Furniture overturned, items broken. A violent struggle had taken place. Jan ran upstairs to Robin's room. What she saw would haunt her forever. Robin was lying face down beside her bed, her body bruised and partially undressed. She was cold to the touch. Jan rushed to her, desperate to save her daughter, but it was already too late. Still, in her shock and disbelief, Jan called 911 and tried to resuscitate her little girl. Though somewhere deep down, she already knew the truth. Robin was gone. As the ambulance sped toward the townhouse, Jan's anguished cries pierced the early morning silence. Her screams echoed through the complex, waking several neighbors who stepped outside to see what was happening. She was hysterical, pleading for help, calling out Robin's name, desperately trying to make sense of what she had just seen. Police were the first to arrive. They rushed upstairs to Robin's bedroom and confirmed what Jan already knew. Her 11-year-old daughter was dead. But the horror wasn't over. In one of the other rooms, officers discovered a second body. It was 32-year-old Lisa, lying motionless on the bed, covered in bruises. She, too, was dead. The crime scene was immediately sealed off, and both bodies were sent to the medical examiner. Meanwhile, detectives began combing the house for clues, and they didn't have to look far. They quickly found several cigarette butts scattered throughout the home, none of which belonged to either John or Lisa. On Jan's nightstand sat a mysterious set of car keys, the kind used for older Toyota models from the 1980s. No one in the house owned such a vehicle. It seemed the killer may have accidentally left them behind, or left them intentionally, for reasons unknown. Detectives made another disturbing observation. The shower had been recently used, and there was evidence that the killer had washed off blood after the murders. Even more puzzling, the perpetrator had left a pair of socks in the bedroom. Why he did so remained unclear. With Jan's help, police began taking inventory. Several of Lisa's personal belongings were missing. Her driver's license, credit cards, checkbook, and most notably, a watch she had been planning to give to her boyfriend. The watch wasn't valuable, but it had sentimental weight. An engraved message from Lisa to the man she loved. To investigators, the choice of stolen items was strange. The watch, with its personal inscription, would be easily traceable. Any use of the stolen credit cards could be tracked. Why would someone who had just committed a double homicide take such risky, easily identifiable items? Then there were the photos. Family portraits of Robin and her older sister, once displayed on the living room wall, now neatly arranged on an ironing board in the kitchen. It felt symbolic, deliberate. Detectives believed it might have been a message, directed at Jan, or perhaps even the police. Recognizing the severity of the case, local law enforcement requested assistance from the state police. Soon, a team of forensic experts arrived, bringing with them the most advanced tools available at the time. Their first discovery: the killer had entered through a ground-floor bedroom window, slicing through the protective screen to gain access. Once inside, he made his way to Robin's room. On her bed, technicians found biological material, immediately sent to the lab for analysis. Although DNA testing existed in 1990, results weren't instant. Investigators had to wait days, possibly weeks. Meanwhile, the autopsies were conducted. Both Robin and Lisa had suffered numerous blunt force injuries, followed by asphyxiation. Medical examiners determined that pillows had been used to smother them. The damage told a story of brutality and control, but there was worse to come. The forensic team discovered that both victims had been sexually assaulted. Disturbingly, experts concluded the assaults likely occurred after death. Biological samples were collected from Robin's body and fast-tracked for testing. A single male hair was also recovered from Lisa's body. It, too, was sent to the lab for analysis. While forensic specialists worked behind the scenes, police turned their attention to the next step: finding a suspect. Someone capable of such violence, who had left traces behind, and perhaps might already be closer than anyone realized. Not long after the investigation began, detectives received their first real lead, one that hinted at something far more sinister than a random attack. Jan told police that for 3 nights prior to the murders, she had been woken by strange noises outside her home. She recalled hearing the gate creaking, followed by what sounded like someone trying the handle of the sliding back door. Each time she peered into the darkness, but couldn't make out anyone clearly. Still, the unease lingered. Then came the morning of May 9th, just hours before the killings. As daylight filtered into her room, Jan opened her eyes to find a man standing outside her window, staring in at her. He smiled, then vanished. The moment chilled her, but unsure of what she'd seen and unable to get a good look at the man's face, Jan didn't call the police. She assumed he might be a neighbor, as the townhouses in her complex were all connected. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe. Now, with 2 people dead, detectives weren't willing to take chances. They launched a widespread search, starting with Jan's neighbors. They checked not only the residents of her building, but extended the investigation to the surrounding area. Every man in the vicinity was questioned. Their alibis for the night of the murders were scrutinized, and officers began collecting DNA samples. This process narrowed the pool. Of the many men investigated, 19 were flagged as potential suspects. That list was eventually trimmed to 10, but no one could be definitively linked to the crime. No one stood out. Meanwhile, the lab had confirmed a critical finding. The DNA recovered from Robin's body, the sheets and the pillow, all belonged to the same unknown male. It was a single perpetrator. But when the DNA profile was run through the FBI database, there were no matches. Equally frustrating, some of the neighbors refused to provide DNA. Among them, one man began to draw particular attention. Neighbors whispered about him, how he'd been seen peeping through windows, how his behavior had made people uncomfortable. Though he had never been arrested, the stories were enough to raise alarms. Then, shortly after the murders, he suddenly relocated, leaving Florida and moving to Missouri. The timing alone was suspicious. Investigators followed the trail. They tracked the man down, traveled out of state, and questioned him. But despite the red flags, they couldn't conclusively link him to the crime. There was no physical evidence tying him to the scene. When detectives showed Jan a photograph of the man, she paused. She said he did resemble the figure she had seen outside her window that morning. Still, without a clear view and no DNA match, her statement wasn't enough to make an arrest. The man remained on their radar, but for now, his involvement, like so much else in this case, remained uncertain. As investigators scrambled for answers, another neighbor came forward with a troubling observation. She reported seeing a strange car slowly cruising through the townhouse complex the day before the murders. It wasn't familiar. The vehicle crept between the buildings, and behind the wheel was a man wearing a red cap. Something about him seemed off. She took note, but by the time detectives followed up, the car and its driver had vanished. Despite their best efforts, police were never able to track him down. Detectives also pursued another promising lead, the Toyota car keys found in Jan's bedroom. They initiated a broad search, attempting to identify every local owner of vehicles matching that make and model from the 1980s. But again, the investigation hit a wall. No matches, no suspects. Attention then shifted to Lisa. Given that the killer had taken deeply personal items, including the engraved watch she had planned to gift her boyfriend, investigators began to wonder if this was more than a random attack. Could this have been personal? They thoroughly investigated Lisa's boyfriend, as well as former partners, friends, and colleagues, but no one in her circle could be linked to the murders. No evidence, no motive, nothing solid. As the weeks turned into months, the case began to stall. Detectives continued their work behind the scenes, interviewing new suspects, collecting DNA samples, hoping for a match. But every single lead ended the same way. A dead end. Meanwhile, Jan Cornell was relentless. She pleaded with the public again and again, begging for any shred of information that might help identify her daughter's killer. What baffled her most was the silence. Despite the brutality of the murders, not a single neighbor reported hearing screams or any signs of struggle that night. Investigators believed the killer would have made a significant amount of noise, but somehow, no one heard a thing. The murders of Robin and Lisa soon captured national attention. Media coverage spread across the country, generating hundreds of tips. Each was followed up. None brought answers. Then, about a year later, a chilling new figure emerged. A 27-year-old man living nearby confessed to 3 separate murders committed over several years. He even told police that if he wasn't locked away for life, he'd kill again. Detectives wondered, could he be responsible for the deaths of Robin and Lisa? They launched a full investigation into his background, movements, and connections. But ultimately, he was ruled out. His crimes, as gruesome as they were, had no link to the Cape Coral case, and so, the trail went cold once more. For years, the case remained open but stagnant. Jan occasionally gave interviews to local news outlets, each time expressing the same heartbreaking hope that one day justice would come, that someone somewhere would speak up. Police insisted the case was never closed, but privately they admitted there were no new leads, no breakthroughs, just a mother's voice echoing through time, waiting for the silence to break. In 2005, 15 years after the murders of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story, the case was reopened in a renewed effort to bring long-awaited justice. For the first time in years, funding was allocated to allow one detective to work on the case full-time for 6 months. Hopes were cautiously high. But despite the detective's commitment and meticulous review of the cold file, the investigation once again hit a dead end. Years passed. The evidence remained shelved. Leads dried up. Forensic science had advanced, but the name of the killer still remained unknown. Then, in August 2016, something completely unexpected happened. In a town just 6 miles from Jan Cornell's home, local police arrested a 54-year-old man after a domestic dispute turned violent. He had fired an air rifle at his adult son during an argument. Fortunately, the son wasn't seriously injured, but the arrest triggered a legal requirement. The man had to provide a DNA sample for the state database. That single act, routine and procedural, would crack open the case. Within days, cold case detectives received the alert they had waited decades for. The DNA profile from the newly arrested man matched all 3 semen samples collected from the crime scene back in 1990. His name was Joseph Zieler. Investigators acted quickly. Although he was already in custody, they obtained a fresh direct DNA sample from Zieler to confirm the match beyond any doubt. The original biological evidence, painstakingly preserved for over 26 years, was pulled from storage and tested against the new sample. The results were conclusive. Zieler's DNA perfectly matched the semen found on Robin's body, her bed sheets, and the pillow. There was no ambiguity. Science had finally caught up with a killer. At the time of the murders, Joseph Zieler had been 28 years old. His criminal history included petty thefts, drug charges, and weapons violations. Nothing that would have required a DNA sample at the time. Just 2 months after the killings, he was arrested for selling stolen goods and possessing an illegal firearm, but he served only a short sentence. Because of outdated laws, no genetic profile was collected, and he flew under the radar. Zieler's name had never appeared in the original investigation. He lived in a nearby town, just outside the circle of suspicion. For 26 years, he had remained a phantom in plain sight. Following the DNA confirmation, Joseph Zieler was arrested for the murders of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story. Prosecutors wasted no time in announcing their intent to pursue the death penalty. Zieler, however, maintained his innocence, claiming he had nothing to do with the crimes. He was booked into jail, where he remained for years as both sides prepared for what would be one of the most anticipated trials in Florida's recent history. That trial finally began on May 8, 2023, almost 33 years to the day since Robin and Lisa were brutally killed. With multiple DNA samples tying him directly to the crime scene, and more damningly, to Robin Cornell's body, Joseph Zieler's chances of escaping justice were slim. Prosecutors anticipated a straightforward trial. The evidence was overwhelming, but no one, not even the most seasoned courtroom observers, could have predicted how Zieler would behave once the trial began. From the start, his erratic, explosive conduct turned the courtroom into a national spectacle, capturing the attention of millions across the country. The prosecution laid out its case in methodical, devastating detail. The cornerstone of their argument was the 3 DNA samples collected from Robin's body, her pillow, and the bed sheets. The prosecutor argued that the death penalty was not only warranted, but necessary. According to him, Zieler's actions were calculated and cold-blooded. He had ample time to reconsider, to stop, but instead, he carried out a brutal double murder, sexually assaulted his victims, stole personal items, arranged family photos, and even took a shower before leaving the scene. In all the years since his arrest, Zieler had shown no remorse. He had nearly 7 years in custody, 7 years to come clean, to provide answers, to offer some measure of closure to the grieving families. Instead, he had remained defiant. When the defense finally presented its case, it was clear they had little to stand on. With DNA evidence beyond dispute, Zieler's attorney didn't try to refute the match. Instead, he floated a vague theory that someone else had committed the murders, and Zieler had no motive to kill either Robin or Lisa. He even suggested that the real killer may have known Jan Cornell and was targeting her specifically. Then came Zieler's turn on the stand, and the courtroom descended into chaos. He screamed at jurors, shouted insults at the prosecutor, and even berated his own legal team, flipping them off in front of the court. His behavior was shocking, erratic, and deeply unsettling. When pressed on how his DNA ended up on Robin's pillow and bedding, Zieler offered a new and outrageous explanation. He claimed he had slept with Jan Cornell, Robin's mother, months before the murders. He sneered as he said it, adding that if his DNA was still present, it was because she never washed her sheets, calling her a pig. Jan, sitting just feet away, had to listen in silence. Through tears and disbelief, she told the court she had never seen this man before his arrest. She had never invited him into her home, let alone had any relationship with him. To dismantle Zieler's fabrication, the prosecution brought in a forensic expert who explained in no uncertain terms the semen samples were fresh. Lab documentation confirmed this. Had they been months old, it would have been immediately evident during the initial investigation. Even more damning, one of the samples was recovered from Robin's body, entirely discrediting Zieler's desperate lie. But Zieler didn't stop. He turned his fury back on Jan, lashing out with more obscenities while his own attorneys begged him to stop. They warned him that his behavior was only helping the prosecution's case. He didn't care. He refused to listen. When the trial came to a close, it took the jury just 5 hours to reach a verdict, a strikingly short deliberation for a capital case. Joseph Zieler was found guilty of the murders of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story. Now it was up to the court to decide his fate. Joseph Zieler's behavior during sentencing shocked the courtroom yet again, but more on that in a moment. Following the guilty verdict, Zieler's defense team made one final push to spare his life. They pleaded with the court to drop the death penalty, arguing that Joseph had endured a difficult childhood under the control of an extremely strict father. They also claimed he suffered from undiagnosed mental disorders, suggesting he lacked full culpability for his crimes. The defense added another twist, alleging that Joseph had lost his memory in 1998 after a motorcycle accident, rendering him unable to recall details of the murders. But the prosecution was ready. Psychological experts, who had evaluated Zieler at length, testified that there was no evidence to support any of these claims. In their professional opinion, Joseph was mentally competent, fully aware of his actions, and capable of premeditated violence. He was, they said, entirely fit to face the death penalty. In late June 2023, Joseph Zieler was escorted back into court for the final sentencing phase. The courtroom, already tense, held its breath as he entered. Then came a moment no one expected. As Zieler approached his seat, he leaned in toward his attorney, and suddenly, without warning, he drove his elbow into the side of his own lawyer's head. Gasps filled the courtroom as security officers rushed in and restrained him. Despite the unprovoked attack, the attorney declined to press charges and continued representing Zieler to the end. But there was nothing more he could do. Shortly after, the judge imposed the ultimate sentence: death. Joseph Zieler was taken away and transferred to prison, where he awaits execution to this day. For Jan Cornell and Lisa Story's family, it was the justice they had waited more than 3 decades to see. Though Zieler never once admitted guilt, the overwhelming physical evidence, his DNA on the victims and at the scene, left no room for doubt. In the end, the families could finally breathe again. Jan and Lisa's loved ones publicly thanked the investigators, prosecutors, and everyone who fought to solve a case that had haunted their lives for so long. But the darkness didn't end with Joseph. In a disturbing postscript to the trial, in February 2024, authorities arrested Zieler's 32-year-old son on charges of possessing illegal materials involving minors. He now faces a potential prison sentence of his own, and if convicted, he could be incarcerated in the very same facility where his father now sits on death row. Case 3. Vanessa Marcotte jogging murder. Vanessa Marcotte was born on June 17, 1989, in the quiet town of Leominster, Massachusetts. Her parents separated shortly after she was born, but despite the divorce, Vanessa maintained a close bond with her father. He stayed nearby and remained an active part of her life, making sure he never missed a moment. From early childhood, Vanessa developed a deep love for the outdoors and athletics, interests she shared with her dad. The two spent weekends hiking, skiing in the mountains, and taking day trips to the coast. As she grew older, Vanessa's passion for fitness expanded into yoga and long-distance running. She even participated in 2 major charity marathons, raising funds for causes she believed in. But Vanessa wasn't just about nature and movement. She was fiercely dedicated to her education. After graduating high school, she earned a communications degree from Boston University, then built her career step by step, working for several firms before finally landing her dream job at Google. The new position brought her to New York City, where she poured her energy into work and giving back to the community through charity work. Despite her busy lifestyle, Vanessa never lost sight of what mattered most. She frequently made the 180-mile trip back to Princeton, a small town not far from where she grew up, to spend time with her family. In early August 2016, at 27 years old, Vanessa returned home for a weekend visit. She stayed at her mother's house, reconnected with relatives, and caught up with friends. It was a relaxing break from city life. She was set to head back to New York on Sunday, August 7th. That Sunday started off quietly. Vanessa spent the morning at home with her mom. Later that afternoon, with just a few hours left before her scheduled bus, she decided to go for a short jog, a familiar habit, even when traveling. There was plenty of time before she had to leave, and she wanted to squeeze in a final run along the rural road near her mother's home. The area was peaceful, surrounded by dense trees and set-back homes hidden from the street. It was a route she'd taken before, a place that felt safe. Vanessa told her mom she'd be back in about 30 minutes, but she never came back. As the minutes ticked by, Vanessa's mother began to worry. Her daughter still needed to pack, and her bus back to New York was fast approaching. She tried calling Vanessa's phone. No answer. At first, she thought maybe Vanessa had lost track of time or stopped to chat with someone along her jogging route. But an hour passed, and her phone suddenly started going straight to voicemail. That's when the anxiety turned into something darker. Frantically, Vanessa's mother began calling friends and family, hoping someone, anyone, had seen her daughter. Maybe she had dropped by to say goodbye or had decided to squeeze in a quick visit before leaving town. No one had seen her. Now fearing the worst, her mother called the police. Officers responded immediately and spoke with her, gathering details of Vanessa's route. A winding road bordered by woods, with houses tucked behind thick rows of trees. Police began a coordinated search along the area Vanessa was believed to have jogged. Friends, neighbors, and relatives joined in, fanning out into nearby fields and trails, hoping for a miracle. Vanessa's bus was scheduled to leave at 5:30 p.m. Every second that passed without word from her made it more certain something was terribly wrong. Vanessa was responsible. She was punctual. She never would have missed the last bus back to New York, not without a call, a message, something. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, local authorities called in state police, who deployed search dogs and additional officers. Among those searching was Vanessa's father, who was growing increasingly distraught. At one point, officers had to gently ask him to step back. His panic was beginning to hinder the process. Then, around 8:20 p.m., a search team pushed deeper into the wooded area, less than a mile from her mother's house. The dogs picked up a scent and began pulling the officers in one direction. And then, they stopped. Lying in the underbrush was a body. Despite the bruises, there was no doubt. It was Vanessa Marotte. Her clothes were missing, except for a single sneaker found near the scene. The sneaker, like part of her body, had been partially burned. Vanessa had suffered numerous injuries and visible burns, suggesting that her killer had tried and failed to use fire to destroy evidence. The scene was brutal. Investigators quickly suspected that Vanessa had been sexually assaulted and that this may have been the motive behind the crime. In a matter of hours, a weekend visit home had turned into every family's worst nightmare. A beautiful, bright, and driven young woman had gone out for a jog and never made it home. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. As investigators examined the scene, they noted that Vanessa's clothing, along with her headphones and smartphone, were missing. None of these items were found near the body. It quickly became clear that the killer had likely taken them, perhaps to conceal evidence or as a twisted trophy. Vanessa's body was turned over to the medical examiner, while detectives launched a full-scale search for her killer. The news spread quickly through Princeton, a small, tight-knit town where violent crime was virtually unheard of. The last homicide had occurred more than 30 years ago. Now, with the brutal murder of a young woman right near her childhood home, the town was thrown into panic. Residents were stunned and afraid. Was the killer one of them? Was he still nearby, waiting to strike again? The medical examiner's report confirmed what many feared. Vanessa had been strangled to death. Her body bore multiple injuries, some clearly inflicted during a struggle. Defensive wounds. She had fought back. Under her fingernails, forensic analysts discovered skin particles, and subsequent DNA testing revealed the profile of an unknown male. It was a critical discovery. Investigators immediately entered the profile into the FBI's national database, hoping for a match. But there was none. The attacker had no criminal record, at least not one linked to his DNA. Still, the sample became the central piece of evidence in the case. Now, any suspect's DNA could be directly compared to this profile. Police also knew to look for someone with visible scratches, possibly on their face, neck, or arms, injuries that Vanessa may have inflicted in a desperate attempt to save her life. As for the burn marks, experts confirmed what detectives suspected. Gasoline had been used. The killer had likely poured it on her body in an attempt to destroy evidence. DNA, fingerprints, any trace of the crime. But his attempt failed. The fire either didn't take or was abandoned mid-act. The medical team could not definitively determine whether Vanessa had been sexually assaulted, but based on the condition of the crime scene and the targeted violence, detectives continued to consider it a primary motive. They also couldn't rule out the possibility that the attacker had known Vanessa personally. Determined to catch the killer, detectives turned to the community for help. With a population of just 3,000, Princeton was the kind of town where everyone knew each other. Investigators urged residents to come forward with anything suspicious, no matter how small, and specifically asked them to be on the lookout for any man with fresh scratches on his body. It wasn't long before that call for help led to a major break in the case. The break investigators had been hoping for finally came from the community. A witness stepped forward, reporting that on the day of Vanessa's murder, around 12:45 p.m., he had been driving along the rural road near her mother's house. As he passed a clearing, he noticed a dark SUV parked on the roadside, its hood propped open. Standing next to the vehicle was a Latino man, estimated to be between 20 and 30 years old, of medium height and solid build. The encounter had lasted only a few seconds. The driver had been going too fast to catch finer details. But one thing stood out. The man appeared to have either short-cropped hair or a shaved head. About 90 minutes later, the same witness drove back along the same road. The SUV was still there, but now the hood was down, the windows were all shut, and the man was gone. At the time, it seemed unremarkable, just a broken-down car. But after learning about Vanessa's murder, the witness felt uneasy. Could that man have been the killer? Another witness came forward with a second chilling account. He had seen Vanessa jogging along the road that same afternoon and noticed a car following her. The driver had first passed by, then circled back and began trailing her. It had struck him as strange, but unfortunately, he hadn't seen the license plate or gotten a clear look at the vehicle's make or model. Still, the pattern was beginning to emerge. Then came a third lead. At a ski resort roughly 10 minutes from Princeton, a worker reported spotting a suspicious man with scratches on his face. The man had passed through the resort briefly and had been caught on a surveillance camera. The witness turned over the footage to police, and investigators quickly identified the man and began digging into his background. Initially, the scratched face raised alarms. Was this the result of a struggle with Vanessa? But after careful review, detectives ruled him out. A DNA test confirmed he was not the source of the genetic material found on Vanessa. Another promising lead had turned cold. Over the next few weeks, the case exploded in visibility. Police received more than 1,000 tips, many of which seemed promising at first glance. Each one was investigated, each one meticulously vetted. But time and again, investigators hit the same wall, dead ends. The killer remained out there, anonymous, unseen, and still free. As the weeks turned into months, detectives expanded their investigation, not just within Princeton, but across neighboring towns as well. They combed through registries of dark SUV owners, followed up on witness reports, and re-examined known offenders in the area. None of it led anywhere. Vanessa's family couldn't bear to wait in silence. Determined to help, they took matters into their own hands. They printed and distributed flyers in surrounding towns, hoping someone had seen something. They also launched a website dedicated to Vanessa's case, compiling every known detail in the hope that a clue, no matter how small, might reach the right person. But despite the overwhelming support from the community and a steady stream of tips, nothing panned out. Detectives had interviewed and cleared hundreds of men, scoured Vanessa's personal and professional life, and exhausted nearly every local lead. With each dead end, hope faded. At that point, the FBI stepped in. Several of their criminal profilers reviewed the case. Their findings painted a chilling profile of the man behind the murder. They concluded that Vanessa had likely been the victim of a spontaneous attack, not by someone she knew, but by a stranger. According to their analysis, the killer may have driven past her, seen her jogging alone, and made the split-second decision to strike. They also believed the man either lived in Princeton or visited the town regularly, perhaps for work or to see relatives. What troubled investigators most was the suggestion that the killer might be a sociopath, someone without guilt, without conscience, and skilled at deception. He could be hiding in plain sight. Such individuals, profilers warned, often appear calm and composed after violent crimes. He might have returned to work, had dinner with family, smiled at his neighbors, and no one would have suspected a thing. As spring approached, the case remained stubbornly cold. Detectives continued chasing down leads, but the trail was fading. Some feared the killer might never be found. Then, 9 months after the murder, everything changed in the most unexpected way. In April 2017, a state patrol officer was driving through Worcester, about 18 miles from Princeton, when something caught his attention. A black SUV matching the witness description from the day of Vanessa's murder. Behind the wheel was a Latino man with short hair. The officer's instincts kicked in. The case had circulated through law enforcement circles for months, and the description still burned in the minds of local officers. Acting quickly, the trooper grabbed a pen and jotted the license plate number down on his hand before the vehicle disappeared from view. Back at the station, he ran the plate. The SUV was registered to a 31-year-old man named Angelo Ortiz. He immediately passed the information on to the detectives working Vanessa's case. For the first time in nearly a year, investigators had a name and a real lead. Angelo Ortiz had no criminal record. On paper, he appeared to be an ordinary man, living quietly in Worcester with his girlfriend and their 3 children. He had only been in the area for less than a year, but now, detectives believed they had found the man who had brutally taken Vanessa Marat's life. Officers went to his residence to request a DNA sample, but as soon as Ortiz opened the door, they hit an immediate obstacle. He barely spoke English. Fortunately, one of the officers was fluent in Spanish, and Ortiz's girlfriend, who was home at the time, offered to help translate. Through the conversation, Ortiz cooperated and agreed to provide a DNA sample, which was immediately sent to the lab for comparison. While waiting on the results, detectives began to dig deeper into Ortiz's background. They learned he worked as a delivery driver, transporting packages between a regional warehouse and various post offices throughout central Massachusetts. This meant Ortiz was familiar with back roads and rural towns, including Princeton. Investigators then obtained location data from Ortiz's cell phone provider. Though the data was approximate based on cell tower pings rather than GPS, it painted a telling picture. Ortiz was in Princeton at the time of Vanessa's murder, and more specifically, in the vicinity where her body was found. It didn't end there. Digging further, detectives uncovered a bank transaction made shortly after the estimated time of Vanessa's death. Records showed that Ortiz had used his card at a gas station just a few miles from Princeton. The purchase? $5 worth of gasoline. He had filled a small gas can, and investigators immediately remembered that traces of gasoline had been found on Vanessa's body and her sneaker. It was a chilling connection. To the detectives, the pieces were falling into place. Then, the DNA results came in. Ortiz's sample was a perfect match to the skin particles found under Vanessa Marat's fingernails. She had scratched him during the attack, fighting back with everything she had, and in doing so, she had unknowingly left behind the evidence that would catch her killer. With that confirmation, police moved quickly. Ortiz was arrested and charged with Vanessa's murder. He denied everything. Despite the overwhelming evidence, DNA, cell tower data, the gas purchase, Ortiz maintained his innocence. He claimed to have had nothing to do with Vanessa's death. The case was now headed for trial, and justice for Vanessa Marotte was finally within reach. Armed with a DNA match and cell tower data placing him near the crime scene, the prosecution was confident they had built a case strong enough to secure a conviction against Angelo Ortiz. But then, an unexpected challenge emerged. After Ortiz secured legal representation, his attorneys argued that the DNA sample should be thrown out. Their claim? The language barrier during the initial police interaction had invalidated his consent. According to the defense, Ortiz had no clear understanding of what was happening when officers asked for a DNA sample. He didn't speak English fluently, and his legal team contended that he only agreed to the test because his girlfriend told him to cooperate. Ortiz said he had signed documents he couldn't read and insisted he had never intended to give up his DNA voluntarily. This presented a major obstacle for the prosecution. The DNA evidence was their strongest piece, a match to skin found under Vanessa Marotte's fingernails. If the court ruled the sample inadmissible, Ortiz could walk free. After lengthy hearings and legal wrangling, the judge ultimately ruled in favor of the prosecution. The DNA results would be allowed. Still, Ortiz refused to confess. What followed was a slow, painful stretch of legal delays. The trial prep dragged on for years, with repeated postponements. Ortiz remained in jail, unable to afford the $10 million bail. In all, it took more than 6 years after Vanessa's murder before the case would finally make it to trial. This presented a major obstacle for the prosecution. The DNA evidence was their strongest piece, a match to skin found under Vanessa Marotte's fingernails. If the court ruled the sample inadmissible, Ortiz could walk free. After lengthy hearings and legal wrangling, the judge ultimately ruled in favor of the prosecution. The DNA results would be allowed. Still, Ortiz refused to confess. What followed was a slow, painful stretch of legal delays. The trial prep dragged on for years, with repeated postponements. Ortiz remained in jail, unable to afford the $10 million bail. In all, it took more than 6 years after Vanessa's murder before the case would finally make it to trial. For Vanessa's grieving family, the wait was torturous. They had already endured the unimaginable, and now, justice felt forever just out of reach. Meanwhile, more disturbing details about Ortiz came to light. Though he had only lived in Worcester for less than a year, he had already developed a dark reputation in his neighborhood. Several women came forward, telling police that they found Ortiz creepy and aggressive. He often made vulgar, sexual comments, and many felt genuinely afraid to be around him. One of the most revealing accounts came from a former employee of the Princeton post office. She had encountered Ortiz regularly during his delivery runs. What stood out wasn't just the frequency of his visits, it was his behavior. She told detectives that Ortiz often made inappropriate comments in Spanish, assuming she couldn't understand. But she did, and his words were offensive enough to make her feel uneasy every time he appeared. She also revealed something else. She had regularly walked to work along the same rural road where Vanessa had gone jogging. After Vanessa's murder, the realization hit her hard. She moved out of town, unable to walk that path or sleep in that town, without thinking of what could have happened to her. As the years dragged on, prosecutors weighed their options. While they had enough evidence to convict Angelo Ortiz, there was still a risk. A trial meant more delays, more trauma for Vanessa's family, and the looming possibility of appeals that could stretch on for decades. Eventually, the prosecution made a calculated decision. they would offer Ortiz a plea deal, one that would guarantee a conviction and keep him behind bars for the rest of his life, or close to it. Without the deal, Ortiz faced a life sentence with a chance of parole only at a much older age. With the deal, that chance, however slim, remained. After some deliberation, Ortiz accepted. In October 2022, more than 6 years after Vanessa Moreau was murdered, Angelo Ortiz stood before a judge and pled guilty. As with many plea deals, he was not required to recount the details of his crime. He simply had to admit that he was guilty. To some, it felt unjust. No confession, no answers, no remorse. But the terms of the deal were severe. Ortiz received 20 years for robbery, acknowledging that he had stolen Vanessa's phone and headphones. For the murder, he was sentenced to 25 years to life, with no possibility of parole for 45 years. By the time Ortiz is eligible to apply for release, he will be 81 years old, if he lives that long. But there was one more heartbreak to come. Just 10 days before sentencing, Vanessa's father passed away, his health having steadily declined under the weight of grief. At the hearing, his former wife addressed the court, saying, "He died of a broken heart and the unbearable grief caused by the murderer." Ortiz, even then, showed no emotion. He did not speak. Instead, he had his attorney read a short statement on his behalf. In it, Ortiz acknowledged that Vanessa's family likely saw him as a monster. But rather than apologize to them, he turned his words toward his own relatives, expressing sorrow for the pain he had caused his family, who had stood by him throughout the legal process. He never offered a single word of apology to Vanessa's loved ones. Following sentencing, Ortiz was returned to prison, where he remains to this day. In the aftermath of Vanessa's murder, her family and friends channeled their grief into action. They founded a nonprofit in her name, originally focused on women's self-defense training. But over time, their mission expanded. Today, the organization addresses a wide range of issues related to women's safety, advocacy, and the prevention of gender-based violence. Vanessa's life was taken too soon, but her name now stands for something powerful: hope, safety, and the fight to protect others from harm. Case 4. The murder of Michelle Bright. Michelle Bright was born on June 2, 1981, in the small rural town of Gulgong, Australia. A quiet, close-knit community of just 2,500 people. Tucked away from the bustle of major cities, Gulgong was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and unfamiliar faces stood out. Outsiders rarely came through. Michelle lived there with her parents and 2 older brothers. She attended the local school, had a wide circle of friends, and was known for her vibrant spirit and kindness. She loved playing basketball, but more than anything, she dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Her love for animals was so strong, she even had a horse of her own. Michelle also talked often of wanting a big family someday. 6 children, to be exact. By 1999, at 17 years old, Michelle was focused on her future. She poured herself into her studies, hoping top grades would help her gain entry into veterinary school. On the evening of February 26th, Michelle had plans to attend a friend's birthday party. The night was mapped out. She would join the celebration at her friend's house and later spend the night at another friend's place, since her own home was a bit too far to walk back safely after dark. That evening, her mother drove her to the party, as Michelle didn't yet have a car. Just before getting out of the vehicle, she turned to her mom and said, "See you in the morning." They exchanged quick goodbyes, neither realizing it would be the last time they'd speak. The next morning, when Michelle's mother woke up, she noticed her daughter still wasn't home. At first, she wasn't alarmed. Michelle was likely just sleeping in after a late night out. But as the hours passed, concern set in. Michelle didn't own a mobile phone, so her mother began calling around, reaching out to her daughter's friends to see where she might be. That's when she learned something unsettling. Michelle had left the party around 12:30 a.m., accepting a ride from a couple who offered to drop her off in the town center. From there, it was only a short walk to the friend's house where she planned to spend the night. But Michelle never arrived, and that short walk through a quiet town in the middle of the night would mark the beginning of a haunting mystery, one that would shake the community of Gulgong to its core. As the hours dragged on with no word from Michelle, her mother's concern deepened into full-blown panic. Still clinging to hope, she called more friends, thinking maybe Michelle had changed plans and stayed with someone else for the night. But each call brought the same answer. No one had seen Michelle after the party. No one knew where she was. By the time she'd exhausted every name on the list, it had already been several hours, and not a single trace of her daughter had surfaced. Left with no other options, Michelle's mother went to the police. But instead of help, she was met with resistance. Officers at the local station brushed off her concerns, suggesting Michelle was probably just out with friends or had run away. Despite her pleas, explaining that her daughter wasn't the type to disappear, that something felt terribly wrong, the police refused to launch a search. Frustrated and terrified, Michelle's mother and her family took matters into their own hands. They canvassed the town, knocked on doors, talked to neighbors, retraced every possible route Michelle could have taken that night. For days they searched, but found nothing. Then came the evening of March 2nd. A man was out walking his dog along a quiet road just outside of Gulgong. The sun had started to set when something in the tall grass near an old railway line caught his attention. He stopped, took a closer look, and froze. It was a body. He called police immediately. When officers arrived, they recognized her at once. It was Michelle Bright. Her clothing was partially missing, and her bra had been torn off. Her school bag was found nearby in the grass, but there were no obvious clues left behind. The site was quiet, undisturbed, and chillingly close to home, less than half a mile from where Michelle lived. Hidden by thick grass, her body had been just out of view for days. The medical examiner confirmed what everyone feared. Michelle had been brutally assaulted and strangled. Her body bore multiple bruises, consistent with a violent struggle. In her hand, investigators found a few strands of hair, possibly torn from her attacker during the assault. But any hope that those hairs might help identify the killer was quickly dashed. No usable DNA could be extracted from them, and the scene yielded no other biological evidence. Whoever had taken Michelle's life had left almost nothing behind. A vibrant 17-year-old girl had vanished during a short walk through her own hometown, and now she was gone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. With the discovery of Michelle Bright's body, the case was no longer a missing person. It was now a murder investigation. And only then did police begin to treat it with the urgency it had always deserved. Their first step was to retrace Michelle's final known movements, starting with the birthday party she had attended on the night of February 26th. Forensic experts estimated that Michelle had likely been killed that same night, meaning someone who was at the party or someone nearby might have seen something, or worse, been involved. Detectives interviewed everyone who had been there. According to all accounts, the night had been uneventful. There were no arguments, no drama, and no signs of trouble. Michelle had been in good spirits, laughing and chatting with friends. No one saw her get into any kind of disagreement. When it came time to leave, she accepted a ride from a couple who offered to drop her in the town center. Police quickly located the couple. They confirmed Michelle's story. They had dropped her off on the main street in Gulgong, where she planned to walk a short distance to her friend's house for the night. After dropping her off, they said they drove away and didn't see where she went next. But Michelle's friend confirmed what her mother had feared. Michelle never arrived. That left investigators with two possibilities. Either she was attacked before reaching her friend's house, or she had changed her mind and tried to walk home instead. Still, there was a problem. The route from the main street to her friend's house was well traveled, and no one reported hearing screams or a struggle. Investigators doubted that someone could have attacked Michelle in the middle of town without being noticed. It led them to a chilling theory. Michelle may have known her attacker. Perhaps someone offered her a ride, someone she trusted enough to get into a car with. And instead of taking her where she intended to go, they drove her to a secluded location just outside of town, where her body would later be found. Michelle's family strongly supported that theory. They insisted she would never get into a car with a stranger. And in a small town like Gulgong, where everyone knew everyone, outsiders stood out. If someone unfamiliar had approached her, she would have recognized that immediately. In the following weeks, investigators continued their search for answers. They interviewed more residents, checked alibis, and began collecting DNA samples from potential suspects, even though the killer had left behind no usable biological evidence. That fact wasn't made public. Detectives quietly hoped that as DNA technology advanced, they might eventually be able to extract a genetic profile from the hair strands found in Michelle's hand, or from other items of evidence that had, for now, yielded nothing. The investigation was moving, but the clock was ticking, and the killer was still out there. From the earliest days of the investigation, detectives began building a list of potential suspects. One of the first names to surface was Michelle's ex-boyfriend. The two had recently broken up, and according to their mutual friends, he hadn't taken it well. He was reportedly upset about the split, angry even. But despite the emotional motive, there was no physical evidence linking him to Michelle's murder. Investigators also couldn't place him near the route Michelle was walking that night. Without proof he'd had the opportunity, the lead went cold. Another local man also caught the attention of police, not because of what he did, but because of how he reacted. He seemed excessively distraught over Michelle's death, despite the fact that they barely knew each other. His reaction was unsettling. But again, like the ex-boyfriend, there was nothing tying him to the crime. Then, something odd happened. A few days after Michelle's body was discovered, a family member visited the scene to pay their respects. As they walked through the grass where she had been found, they spotted something shining in the dirt. One of Michelle's earrings. It didn't make sense. The area had already been thoroughly searched by police. Had they missed it? Or was it something more sinister? Investigators considered the possibility that the killer had taken the earring with them, and then perhaps returned later to dispose of evidence quietly, hoping it would go unnoticed. The mystery only deepened. Over the following months, detectives compiled a list of 14 individuals who stood out in some way. But connecting any of them to the murder proved nearly impossible. With no usable DNA and no eyewitnesses, the case remained frustratingly out of reach. Most of the suspects agreed to provide voluntary DNA samples, all except one. A 23-year-old man named Mark refused. That decision raised a red flag and prompted investigators to take a much closer look at him. What they found was deeply troubling. Shortly after Michelle's murder, police discovered that Mark had been stalking a local woman for 8 months. On one occasion, he even broke into her home. The behavior escalated when he was later accused of harassing a woman in a nearby town. According to her report, Mark followed her down the street, eventually catching up to her and touching her inappropriately. There wasn't enough evidence to press charges in that case, but to detectives working Michelle's case, it was alarming. Then came another revealing detail. Mark had been in the same class as Michelle's older brother. That meant he could have known the Bright family personally, even Michelle herself. When questioned, Mark claimed he had been in the town center on the night Michelle disappeared, but said he was home by 1:15 a.m. That timeline, if true, would make it almost impossible for him to have committed the crime. There wouldn't have been enough time to abduct Michelle, drive her to field, and carry out the murder. But investigators weren't convinced. When they spoke with Mark's wife, her account didn't line up. She said she wasn't sure when he got home, and in fact, suggested it could have been much later than 1:15 a.m. It wasn't proof. But it was another piece of a puzzle that was beginning to form, and Mark was now at the center of it. The growing suspicion around Mark prompted investigators to take a bold next step. They obtained a warrant and installed a wiretap in his home. What they heard only deepened their concerns. Privately, Mark's wife had doubts of her own. On multiple occasions, she could be heard pressing him for answers, asking if he had anything to do with Michelle Bright's murder. Her questions were persistent, even emotional, suggesting she herself wasn't convinced of his innocence. Eventually, she managed to convince him to cooperate with the police and provide a DNA sample. But just one day before his scheduled appointment, Mark crashed his car into a tree. The circumstances were suspicious enough that investigators considered it might have been a suicide attempt, possibly to avoid what was coming. Still, a few days later, Mark handed over his DNA sample after all. But once again, science hit a wall. Despite Mark's increasingly erratic behavior, police were still missing the one crucial element: the killer's DNA. Without that, or any other concrete evidence, they couldn't arrest him. Suspicion wasn't enough. The case stagnated. Over the next year, detectives continued interviewing new witnesses, exploring other leads, and revisiting the growing list of suspects. But time and again, they were met with dead ends. For Michelle's grieving family, life in Gulgong became unbearable. They were convinced the person responsible for her death was someone local. Perhaps someone they passed by on the street or stood behind in line at the shops. By 2000, unable to bear the weight of that uncertainty, they moved away, leaving behind the only home Michelle had ever known. That same year, a reward of $100,000 was offered for information leading to the killer's capture. It drew in new tips and fresh attention, but none of the leads panned out. In 2002, investigators took another shot in the dark. They traveled to the UK to conduct further analysis on Michelle's belongings, hoping modern labs there might uncover foreign DNA overlooked in earlier testing. But once again, nothing. The case was reopened multiple times in the years that followed. In 2009, in a desperate push for answers, authorities increased the reward to $500,000, the largest in the state's history. The money generated a wave of interest. Hundreds of tips, theories, and phone calls flooded in. But none of them led to the truth. Then, in 2019, 20 years after Michelle Bright was killed, the case was reopened yet again. Despite advances in forensic technology, investigators were still unable to locate any foreign DNA on Michelle's body or clothing. It was a devastating reality. The killer had left no traceable evidence behind. With DNA no longer a viable path forward, detectives returned to the original list of suspects, now trimmed to just 5 names. After meticulously re-evaluating each of them, they narrowed the list down to 2. And for the first time in years, they had a renewed focus, and possibly a path toward finally getting justice for Michelle. Among the 2 remaining suspects in the Michelle Bright murder investigation, one name rose to the top. Craig Rumsby, a 56-year-old man with a deeply troubling past. At the time of Michelle's death in 1999, Craig lived just 2 houses away from her family. That alone raised concern, but what drew even more suspicion was that Craig abruptly moved to Sydney just 2 weeks after the murder. His background was far from clean. Craig had a lengthy criminal history, including multiple arrests for indecent exposure, harassment, and other sexually motivated offenses. He was also known to be involved in petty theft and other illegal activities. But perhaps most disturbingly, Craig had already been linked to a prior assault, one that took place in Gulgong just a year before Michelle was killed. In that case, a young woman had returned home after a party and was sitting on her front porch, waiting for her boyfriend. Without warning, a man, later identified as Craig, approached her, struck her, and attempted to sexually assault her. The attack ended abruptly when the woman's boyfriend arrived, scaring Craig off. The woman reported the incident to police, but ultimately, no charges were filed. Despite the severity of the attack, her testimony alone wasn't considered strong enough to guarantee a conviction. Faced with the risk of losing in court, the authorities let it go. Craig walked free. To the investigators now revisiting Michelle's case, it was a glaring red flag. Craig had the proximity, the history, and the pattern of violence. They were convinced he was their man, but without physical evidence or DNA, they needed a confession. So detectives made a bold, high-stakes decision. They would set up an elaborate undercover sting. Knowing Craig's criminal leanings, police created a fake crime syndicate, posing as members of a serious underworld network, one with deep connections, including supposed insiders within law enforcement. The organization claimed to be moving large sums of money and was recruiting one more member for their growing operation. Craig took the bait. Intrigued and drawn to the perceived power and promise of protection, he agreed to join. Over the next several months, undercover officers worked to gain his trust, drawing him deeper into their fictitious world. They told Craig that their group was like a family, but with one condition: complete honesty. "If you've got skeletons in your closet," they told him, "we need to know. Because if we can't trust you, you'll never be part of the big jobs." To maintain the illusion, the group carried out a series of crimes. The police never disclosed details, but it's believed some were staged events, or minor thefts meant to appear real. Whatever it took to build credibility and keep Craig engaged. The operation dragged on for nearly a year, and then, with trust secured, investigators decided it was time to move into the next phase, one that would either bring the truth into the light or risk losing their only shot at solving one of New South Wales's most haunting unsolved murders. The undercover operation was now entering its most critical stage. By this point, Craig had been fully drawn into the fictitious criminal network. The undercover team decided it was time to apply pressure, not directly, but subtly and psychologically. They hinted that the police were reopening an old murder case and that Craig's name had surfaced. It was vague enough to avoid raising suspicion, but clear enough to send a message. During a conversation with one of the gang members, Craig nervously said, "I hope they won't question me about the murder of Michelle Bright." He quickly tried to deflect suspicion by adding, "She was like a sister to me. I knew her since she was a baby." But the investigators didn't let up. Shortly after, another operative, this time posing as a corrupt detective on the gang's payroll, met with Craig. He told him that investigators from a small town had reactivated an old case and were actively closing in on him. It was designed to feel like inside information, something only a connected criminal syndicate could offer. And then came phase 3 of the operation. The real police held a press conference, announcing a record-breaking $1 million reward for any information leading to Michelle Bright's killer. It was the largest reward in the history of New South Wales, and it made headlines across the country. The move was a strategic blow meant to destabilize Craig emotionally and make the pressure feel real. The very same day, Craig responded to a police department social media post about the reward with a public comment. "It's so sad that they haven't caught her killer. Michelle was like a sister to me. I feel sorry for the family." But behind the scenes, the undercover team was preparing to bring the operation to a head. Craig was invited to meet the gang's elusive boss, a figure he'd never seen before. That boss was actually an experienced undercover officer brought in for the final confrontation. During the meeting, the boss told Craig that the police were onto him, not for one, but for 2 separate cases. His involvement posed a serious threat to the entire organization, and if there was anything Craig needed to come clean about, now was the time. Still, Craig denied everything. But then, the boss pulled out a manila folder, thick with fabricated police materials from the Michelle Bright case. Inside were case files, reports, and a photo of Craig's old car, the same one he'd owned back in 1999. The undercover detective pointed out that shortly after Craig had spoken to police by phone in '99, his car was found burned, a suspicious move that had always remained in the case file. He leaned in, saying investigators had gathered enough to make an arrest at any moment. That was the turning point. Faced with what appeared to be incontrovertible evidence, and under the illusion that a powerful crime syndicate was willing to protect him if he told the truth, Craig's facade finally cracked. And then, he began to talk. Craig's confession came in fragments, disjointed and soaked in alcohol-induced haze. He told the undercover gang boss that on the night of Michelle's murder, he had driven into Gulgong, visited a friend, and then wandered into the town center. There, he stopped at a local bar and chatted briefly with the owner. He believed he left his car nearby and began walking, but said his memory beyond that point was blurry due to heavy drinking. Still, amid the fog, Craig admitted he killed Michelle Bright. But for the detectives, that vague admission wasn't enough. It lacked substance. It lacked proof. So the gang leader made him an offer. Go back to the scene of the crime with a few trusted members, jog his memory, and afterward, they would take him to the airport and help him vanish. Craig agreed. At the remote stretch near the railway tracks, where Michelle's body was found 2 decades earlier, Craig walked through the grass and reenacted the crime. He described how he dragged Michelle off the roadside, trying to conceal her body in the tall brush. He said he couldn't remember if he had assaulted her, but he remembered removing parts of her clothing. Crucially, he mentioned the broken clasp on her bra, a detail that had never been released publicly. It was something only the killer would know. Then came another admission. Craig confessed to an attempted sexual assault on a woman a year before Michelle's death, the very case where he had once been named a suspect, but never charged. He described how he struck the woman and tried to attack her until her boyfriend arrived and scared him off. The details he shared matched the victim's account exactly, confirming the truth of his confession. The trap was now complete. After Craig's walkthrough of the crime, the gang members escorted him to the airport as promised. But this time, real police were waiting. 20 years after Michelle Bright's murder, Craig was arrested and charged. He was taken into custody, where he would remain as prosecutors prepared for trial. The trial, a long-awaited reckoning. The trial began in 2023, with Craig facing two major charges: the murder of Michelle Bright and the attempted assault from the previous year. Despite his recorded confession and the damning details he'd given, Craig pleaded not guilty. His defense team argued that the confession had been made under psychological pressure. They claimed Craig was manipulated, cornered by a fake criminal gang, and terrified for his safety. The confession, they insisted, was false and coerced. But the prosecution pushed back hard. Craig hadn't been threatened. He had voluntarily joined the group, built trust over time, and had every opportunity to walk away. More importantly, they pointed to his intimate knowledge of the crime, like the broken bra clasp and how Michelle's body was concealed, as proof that his confession was genuine. Their theory was straightforward. Craig, a neighbor Michelle likely knew and trusted, had offered her a ride or walked her home. It was late and she had no reason to be suspicious. But at some point, likely on the outskirts of town, he turned on her. He attacked, dragged her off the road, and left her in the grass near the old railway line. The trial lasted 7 weeks. Michelle's family sat through every moment, listening as years of anguish and silence were finally given voice in a courtroom. When the jury returned its verdict, they found Craig guilty on both counts. The woman he had assaulted years earlier testified again, only this time, justice would not slip away. The judge sentenced Craig to 32 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 24 years. That means the earliest he could be released would be in his late 70s. A family forever changed. For Michelle's loved ones, the verdict was a long-awaited moment of truth, bittersweet and heavy with grief. Her mother, father, and brothers had carried the weight of her loss for 2 decades. 6 years after Michelle's death, her parents divorced, unable to bear the shared sorrow. Her mother's life never fully recovered. Her father and brothers blamed themselves, haunted by the thought that they hadn't protected her. Now, at last, there was some measure of peace. The man who stole Michelle's future would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars, and the family, though forever broken by tragedy, could finally begin to heal. This isn't just a murder case. It's one of the most disturbing and unforgettable stories ever told on this channel. A young mother, brutally killed in her own home. 15 years later, the killer was exposed, thanks to a tiny, overlooked detail. What you're about to hear will stay with you. Kathy Martin was born on October 25, 1959, in Houston, Texas. Raised in a warm, tight-knit family, she shared a particularly close bond with her sister. During high school, Kathy met a young man named Mike, and their relationship blossomed into marriage a few years later. The couple settled in a quiet suburb just outside Houston. Life moved quickly, in the best way. Shortly after tying the knot, they welcomed their first child, a daughter. 3 years later, in early 1987, Kathy gave birth to their second child, a son. She was just 27. With 2 young kids at home, Kathy chose to focus entirely on motherhood. Mike worked full-time at a small sign-making business owned by Kathy's father. The job paid well enough, and with financial support from her parents, Kathy didn't have to worry about returning to work. Her days were dedicated completely to her children. March 3rd, 1987, began like any other. Kathy was home with the kids, and Mike was working his usual shift. After work, Mike decided to grab a drink with some friends and headed to a local bar. At some point, he stepped out to call Kathy from a payphone, just to check in. But she didn't answer. That alone was strange. Kathy rarely left the house, and certainly not without a good reason. Mike tried again and again. Still, no answer. Growing uneasy, Mike called their neighbor, a man named Tim, and asked him to stop by the house to see if everything was all right. Tim agreed. He walked over, knocked on the door, but no one came. Peering through the living room window, he noticed the television was on. That made him even more uneasy. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Something didn't feel right. Instead of returning home to make a call, Tim got in his car and began driving around town, searching for a police cruiser. Within minutes, he flagged one down and explained the situation. He asked the officers to come check on Kathy. Something was clearly wrong. And what police would soon discover inside that quiet suburban home would leave the entire community shaken. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. When police arrived at the quiet suburban home and knocked on the door, there was no response. But the door wasn't locked. One officer tried the handle, and it opened with ease. What they found inside was chilling. Lying motionless on the living room sofa was Kathy's young daughter. She was unconscious, visibly injured, and barely breathing. There were signs of blunt trauma, but she was still alive. Officers immediately called for paramedics. As they moved through the home, the horror deepened. In the nursery, Kathy's infant son lay undisturbed in his crib. He was unharmed, miraculously untouched by the violence that had swept through the house. But in the next room, officers made a gruesome discovery. Kathy Martin was lying naked on the floor in a pool of blood. Her lifeless body bore clear signs of a brutal attack. Her hands were bound with a lamp cord, and she showed no signs of life. Officers didn't need a medical examiner to know she was gone. As paramedics rushed Kathy's daughter to the hospital, investigators began to process the crime scene. Not long after, Kathy's father arrived, having heard that something was wrong. Police kept the most disturbing details from him, instead urging him to head to the hospital to be with his granddaughter. There, in a cold waiting room, he learned of his daughter's death via a breaking news segment on the TV. Back at the house, Mike finally arrived. His appearance raised immediate red flags for investigators. For one, his arrival was oddly late considering the timeline. More concerning, however, were several stains on his shirt. Deep red, possibly blood. Detectives took note. They requested Mike's clothing and began questioning him at length. As the investigation unfolded, several strange details came to light. First, the bathroom was dotted with bloodstains. Not random splatter, but smeared patterns consistent with someone trying to clean up. The killer hadn't simply struck and fled. He had lingered, methodically attempting to erase his presence. Second, there were no signs of forced entry. Every door and window was locked from the inside, except for the front door, which was found ajar. It suggested that Kathy had either known her attacker or that the person had a key. But perhaps the most disturbing detail was discovered in the room where Kathy's body lay. Next to her, her clothes were carefully folded and placed on the floor. Not discarded, not torn, but folded. The strange, calculated act raised immediate suspicions that the attack had been sexual in nature and deeply personal. This was no random break-in. It was something far more sinister. As investigators pieced together what had happened inside the house, a chilling theory began to form. They suspected that the killer may have used Kathy's greatest vulnerability, her children, as leverage. It was possible, they believed, that Kathy had been threatened. Do as you're told, or your children will be harmed. Faced with that horrifying choice, she may have complied. But it hadn't saved her. In the end, she was murdered anyway. At the hospital, doctors were in a race against time. Kathy's daughter had suffered blunt force trauma, likely inflicted with bare hands. Her injuries were extensive, and despite the medical team's efforts, she slipped into a coma. Her condition was critical, and her chances of survival hung by a thread. Meanwhile, the county medical examiner conducted a full autopsy on Kathy. What they found painted a picture of unimaginable violence. She had been stabbed 16 times, mostly in the abdomen. She had also been sexually assaulted. From the assault, investigators were able to recover biological material from the perpetrator. But it was 1987, and DNA technology was still in its infancy. Full genetic profiling wasn't yet an option. The most the forensic team could do was determine the suspect's blood type. The evidence was secured and sent to a laboratory for processing, in hopes that future advances might one day make use of it. Back at the scene, attention began to turn towards someone close to home. From the very start, police had questions about Kathy's husband, Mike. The reddish stains on his shirt, spotted when he arrived at the scene, had already raised suspicions. The shirt was taken for analysis, but it wasn't just the stains that troubled detectives. It was Mike's behavior. That evening, after finishing work at the sign factory, Mike had gone out drinking with friends. When Kathy didn't answer the phone at home, a highly unusual lapse, he didn't rush home to check on her himself. Instead, he called their neighbor, Tim, and asked him to look in. To detectives, this was a red flag. They'd seen cases like this before. Husbands who staged alibis by going out with friends while a crime took place at home, only to have someone else discover the scene. And if Mike had been the killer, it would also explain the lack of forced entry. He had a key. He wouldn't need to break in. The next step was to verify Mike's timeline. Investigators looked into whether he might have had time to commit the murder before meeting his friends at the bar. What they discovered only deepened their suspicion. Mike had a record. After high school, he'd been arrested for selling drugs to an undercover police officer. He was sentenced to 6 years behind bars, but was released on parole after just 2. It was only after his release that he met and married Kathy. Still, suspicions alone weren't enough. Detectives needed hard evidence if they were going to charge him. And at that point in the investigation, they didn't have it. As investigators expanded their focus, another figure began to raise suspicions: Tim, the neighbor who'd first checked on Kathy at Mike's request. His actions on the day of the murder struck detectives as unusual. Rather than simply calling the police from his home, Tim had driven around town searching for a patrol car. Wanting to be thorough, investigators decided to examine his vehicle. What they found inside raised immediate concerns. There were reddish stains on the floor that looked suspiciously like blood. Samples were quickly collected and sent to the lab for analysis. Theories began to shift. Could this have been a 2-person crime? Had Mike and Tim worked together? Or was one of them responsible while the other served as a red herring? As these questions piled up, medical examiners completed their post-mortem findings and added a new layer to the mystery. Kathy's time of death was pinned at approximately 1 p.m., nearly 6 hours before her body was discovered. This revelation dramatically reshaped the timeline. It meant detectives now had to go back and re-examine what Mike and Tim were doing earlier that afternoon, and whether either of them could have left work long enough to commit the crime. Both men maintained that they were at their respective jobs during that window. Investigators began working to confirm or disprove their alibis. Then, 2 days after the murder, a call came in from the hospital, one that brought a glimmer of hope. Kathy's daughter had awakened from her coma. She was still fragile, but now out of immediate danger. Detectives rushed to her bedside, hoping the young girl could offer some detail, any detail, that might identify the killer. But there was a catch. The child, just 4 years old, had virtually no memory of what had happened that day. The only thing she could recall was seeing a man with light-colored hair enter their home. Both Mike and Tim, however, had dark hair. Still, the detectives were cautious. Given the trauma the child had endured, her recollection could have been distorted. They brought in psychologists to work gently with her in hopes of retrieving more specific memories over time. Then came another twist, this time from the forensics lab. The stains in Tim's car? Not blood at all, but machine oil. And the suspicious marks on Mike's shirt? Just dried paint. That wasn't the end of the surprises. Investigators also verified both men's alibis. Multiple co-workers confirmed that Mike and Tim had each been at work all day, without leaving, during the time of the murder. To put any lingering doubts to rest, both men voluntarily agreed to take polygraph tests. The results showed no signs of deception. The two men who had once stood at the center of the investigation were now effectively cleared. The detectives, once confident they were closing in on their suspect, suddenly found themselves back at the beginning, with no suspect and more questions than ever. With their primary suspects eliminated, detectives turned their attention to other possible leads, particularly anyone who knew Kathy well enough to enter her home without force. They began by speaking with her close friends and relatives, asking a crucial question: who, in their opinion, might have had a reason or opportunity to harm her? Surprisingly, many of them gave the same answer without hesitation: Greg. Greg was Kathy's brother-in-law. According to those closest to her, Kathy had voiced concerns about Greg on numerous occasions. She had told both friends and family that he frequently crossed boundaries. He openly flirted with her, made repeated attempts to convince her to engage in sexual activity, and often made crude, uncomfortable comments, particularly about her stomach. That last detail stood out. As investigators recalled, most of Kathy's stab wounds had been inflicted in the abdominal area. Digging further into Greg's background, detectives learned that he had a documented criminal history and a known history of drug abuse. He was no stranger to trouble. With suspicion mounting, the forensic team began combing through evidence again. Soon, they found something of interest: a fingerprint matching Greg's in the house, as well as a strand of hair that resembled his. But this discovery came with a complication. Greg had often visited Kathy and Mike's home. That fingerprint and stray hair could have easily been left behind during a prior visit, weeks or even months before the crime. As far as physical evidence went, it was inconclusive. Still, suspicions deepened. Kathy's parents, heartbroken and desperate for justice, told investigators they believed Greg was the one who had killed their daughter. Her mother also shared a chilling moment from the hospital. In the middle of the night, Greg had shown up to visit Kathy's daughter, who had just emerged from a coma. The instant the young girl saw him, she turned to her grandmother, her expression full of fear. After Greg left, the grandmother asked if that was the man who had come into the house the day of the murder. The little girl, still struggling with memory loss, said she didn't know. But the look on her face had said plenty. Detectives brought Greg in for formal questioning. He denied everything, stating that he had been with a friend at the time of the murder, though that friend too had a criminal record. Then, in the middle of the interview, Greg casually told officers that he needed to feed the parking meter to avoid a ticket. He stepped outside and never came back. Greg's wife, who was also Kathy's sister, gave investigators a critical piece of the timeline. On the day of the murder, she said Greg had dropped her off at work around 10:30 a.m. and picked her up again at 2:30 p.m. That gave him a 4-hour window, perfectly aligned with the medical examiner's estimate of Kathy's time of death. Still, despite growing suspicion, investigators had no solid evidence tying him directly to the crime. In a last-ditch effort, they turned to the biological sample recovered from Kathy's body. At the time, forensic science was still limited. Experts could only determine the assailant's blood type, and testing would consume most of the remaining evidence. Detectives made the difficult decision to proceed. The test confirmed the semen matched Greg's blood type. But even that wasn't enough to press charges. Blood type analysis, especially in the 1980s, wasn't definitive. Investigators were stuck, once again. Kathy's devastated family remained certain Greg was the killer, but they had no power to move the case forward. Meanwhile, his wife, Kathy's own sister, refused to believe the allegations. She stayed by his side. The years passed. In 1998, 11 years after the murder, police revisited the evidence. New DNA testing methods were now available, and investigators submitted what remained of the sample for analysis. The result? A partial DNA profile, and another frustrating hurdle. The lab confirmed that Greg fell within the 2% of the population who could have produced the same partial match. Strong suspicion, but still not proof. Detectives brought Greg in once again. This time, confronted with the DNA result, he changed his story. Greg now admitted he'd visited Kathy on the day she was murdered and claimed they had a consensual sexual relationship, but insisted she was alive when he left. To seasoned investigators, it was a classic pivot. When confronted with forensic evidence, suspects often claim the encounter was consensual to avoid rape or murder charges. But even that wasn't enough for prosecutors to file charges. Then, in 2002, 15 years after the crime, the case took a major turn. A renowned forensic scientist named Catherine Long, known for pioneering work in trace DNA, joined the investigation. Her lab had recently conducted studies showing that DNA from a suspect's hands could remain on objects used to strangle or restrain a victim, even after brief contact. Detectives immediately thought of the lamp cord used to tie Kathy's hands. That cord had been carefully stored in a paper evidence bag, untouched for over a decade. Swabs were taken from multiple areas of the cord, including blood-stained sections. Forensic analysts found 2 separate DNA profiles. The first belonged to Kathy. The second matched Greg, with certainty. That meant Greg had touched the cord used to bind Kathy's hands, something only the killer would have done. Police moved in. After 15 years, Greg was arrested for the murder of Kathy Martin. During questioning, he stuck to his story, insisting the sex had been consensual and that he was innocent of the murder. But what happened next changed everything. Greg's cellmate contacted detectives, claiming Greg had confessed behind bars. He allegedly described in chilling detail how he had assaulted and killed Kathy. He even admitted to beating her 4-year-old daughter to force Kathy's compliance, then cleaned up and changed into her husband's clothes before fleeing, so he wouldn't leave DNA in his own car. Faced with the DNA evidence and jailhouse confession, Greg broke down. In 2004, he pleaded guilty to murder and received a 45-year prison sentence, but justice was cut short. Just 4 years later, Greg died of liver cancer in prison at age 56. Kathy's husband, Mike, never lived to see the arrest. He died young, at just 45. For Kathy's children and parents, the journey had been long and full of heartache. But they never stopped hoping. They never stopped pushing. And in the end, they were able to thank the detectives who never gave up on the case. 15 years after her brutal murder, justice for Kathy Martin had finally been served. Share your thoughts on this story in the comment section. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.